Embassy of India, Berne. I welcome all of you to this webinar on opportunities in the Indian electronics sector today. Today, with this webinar, we will close this series of 12 webinars organized by the Embassy of India, Berne. In this series, we have focused on the idea that there are tremendous complementarities between India and Switzerland. These complementarities are further enhanced with the focus of the Government of India on increasing the ease of doing business in India and on further integrating with the word a self-reliant India making for the world. Switzerland and India might be distant in terms of time and space, but we are connected with our common spirit of Himalayas and Alps. We have a long-standing dynamic partnership. Before I invite the speakers of this webinar, I quote a few lines written by Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. The current of the word has its boundaries. Otherwise, it could have no existence. But its purpose is not shown in the boundaries which restrain it, but in its movement, which is towards perfection. The wonder is not that there should be obstacles and sufferings in this word, but that there should be law and order, beauty and joy, goodness and love. With those inspiring words, let me note that the speakers of today's webinars will include the knowledge partner of MISSP, T&A Consulting, the legal and tax partner of MISSP, Roddle and Partner, and two special guests of honors whom we have today, Mr. Phil Reich, President of the Swiss Indian Chamber of Commerce, and Mr. Raul Keller from representing Swissmem. In addition, we also have a guest speaker who is joining us from India, representing the Electronics and Software Export Promotion Council of India, Mr. Vinod Sharma. So with those words, let me invite the first speaker of the day, Mr. Tarun Gupta, to please make his presentation on overview of Indian economy amidst the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh.
Gupta,
thank you, Dr. Singh, and for laying a beautiful foundation. Himalayas and Alps, absolutely. You couldn't have given us a better platform. And a big thank you to all the participants. On a Friday afternoon, attending the webinar is always challenging. And I'm also familiar that in this current pandemic, we have a deluge of webinars. So we'll try to keep it as interesting and as meaningful over the next 12 to 13 minutes. In this current pandemic, there are new business models which are being formed, new business partnerships being formed. The idea is, can India be a preferred partner for Switzerland? What is changing in India? What has changed in India? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? The aim would be to give you a balanced view of India and not the Bollywood version. I have divided the presentation into three parts. The first part talks about India in general. The second talks about more the India opportunity. And third, very high level, talks about the reforms in India. So let's begin. India. Four letters would best describe India. 4 Ds. What are these? Democracy, demography, diversity, disparity. Demography, or rather democracy first. We are the largest democracy in the world. 900 odd million people were eligible to vote. 600 million people voted. It shows the participatory nature of our democracy. In fact, it also shows our technology advancement, that the results were out in a couple of hours. However, the democracy can also mean delays, can mean sometimes appear chaotic because it's a consensus-based approach. Demography, very relevant for today's scenario. In fact, India is, in current scenario, only 7% of our population is above the age of 65. And we have over 70% in the working age group. What it means is India would be a source of supply for nearly 1/5 of the global workforce. We add nearly the population of Switzerland every month to our working population. But there's a challenge. We need to create so many jobs. The third is diversity. India is more diverse than Northern to Southern Europe. Diversity in languages, eating habits. We have 22 official languages. However, also the economic development across India is not uniform. There can be a difference of 10x between the most developed state and the least developed state. In fact, if you see on the map, the top 8 states account for 50% of the country's GDP. And finally, we also move on to the graph on my right-hand side, what shows that India has jumped from agrarian to services. In fact, India is the only country which has missed, which has jumped directly and has, in a way, what we need to get right is our manufacturing. Today's services sector, we are proud of it, our IT sector. However, it employs only 1% of our workforce. What is also important, which I forgot to touch upon in my disparity, is that there is disparity in India's wealth. For only top 1% control 60% of the wealth, and top 10% control 77% of the wealth. So these are some of the challenges. But the moot message here is we need to get our manufacturing right. And what's our vision? Our vision is to be 5 trillion economy. Is it ambitious? Very ambitious. It took us 60 years to reach our first trillion. It took us another 7.5 years to reach our second trillion. And now we need to double our GDP in the next 5 years. What it would require is a virtuous cycle of savings, exports, and investments. How are we doing on investments? Over the last 70 years, we've got $600 billion of foreign direct investment. 600. Interestingly, in the last 5 years, we've got half of that, about $300 odd billion. Go deeper. Out of that, 40% has been on greenfield and 90% has been on automatic route, did not require any government approval. And what it means is that India is a very open economy. Most of the sectors are open for 100% foreign FDI. And should you wish, you do not need a local partner. You do not need to share your intellectual property, or you do not need to share your trade secret. In fact, India is ranked as the 3rd most preferred greenfield FDI destination. And why is that? Okay. The next slide answers that. India has shown significant improvement in ease of doing business, jumped 79 positions. We are ranked number 63. We want to be in top 50 of ease of doing business. We are consistently ranked among the top 10 performers in ease of doing business. And now there is a new buzzword. We all heard of BRICS. Now it's MIVIT, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, India, and Thailand. These are the countries who are competing as companies move to rejig their supply chain. And how does India stand? If you look at the rankings, India stands fairly favorably in all the parameters, some of the parameters mentioned here. However, one advantage which India has amongst all the other countries is the large domestic demand. With that, I come to the end of the first section of my presentation, where we spoke about India, the 4 Ds, democracy, demography, diversity, and disparity. We spoke about our vision and our improvement in ease of doing business. Now I move to the second part of my presentation, which is India opportunity. And 4 alphabets can best describe this is CFIT: consumption, formalization, infrastructure, and digitization. So let's begin with the first, consumption. This has been an attraction. India, unlike Southeast Asia, Asian countries, is not an export-driven economy. 60% of our GDP comes from consumption. Today, we are the 6th largest consumer market in the world, tipped to be the 3rd largest in the next 10 years. Our private consumption expenditure is expected to increase to 6 trillion in the next 10 years. However, a word of caution. Some companies overestimate the size of Indian middle class. If you look at the pyramid, there are about 10 million households above $30 million of annual household income, another 25 million households between $15,000 to $30,000. What it effectively means is that there are about 35 million to 40 million households, about 200 million people, which are the consuming class. It's not a small number. However, it's not 1.3 billion. Move on to the next alphabet, which is formalization. This is interesting. India has 75 million enterprises, which is about 22 times the number of enterprises in the US, which is 8 times our economy. So what is different here? Okay, let's look behind the numbers. Out of these 75 million, only 10 million have any kind of tax registration, and only 5 million have any kind of tax and social security registration. So what is the implication? Implication is that our manufacturing firms tend to remain small. Over 85% of our manufacturing firms have less than 50 employees. What has happened is we've created dwarfs, companies which start small and remain small. Whereas what we need to create are babies, companies which grow into adults, because this has a negative impact on our productivity. Second is on tax to GDP ratio. We are about 17 odd percent. This is low compared to other developing countries. South Africa, I think it's 27%, China 22%, Brazil 34%, and less than 6% of our population pays income tax. And third is that India ranks very low on enforcement of contract. We need to bring about better sanctity of contract, better debtor discipline, and that we have a bankruptcy code. First time in India's history, companies were liquidated. And this has brought about more assurance to a foreign company in terms of value of the contract. Next, I move to infrastructure, very relevant for today's topic. This was a problem where it impacted productivity, efficiency. If we have to achieve a $5 trillion economy goal, we need to double our infrastructure spend. Currently, we spend about $150 billion annually. We need to double the run rate to about $300 billion. 70% of that will come from government. That's why we need to increase the tax to GDP ratio. How are we doing? Let me give you a couple of examples. Highways. I won't talk about the road discipline. We have 6 million kilometers of road network in India. National highways is about 140,000 kilometers. 30% of that has been built in the last 6 years. We plan to build another 60,000 kilometers in the next 5 years. So effectively, in the total span of 10 to 11 years, we would have doubled our national highway network. Railways, our total tracks are about 68,000 kilometers. In 70 years, we've electrified 30 odd thousand kilometers. Now we plan to electrify the entire railway network in the next 5 years. I can go on. Power sector. This was a challenge. Quality of power, unavailability of power. We had peak power shortages. We have repivoted to renewable energy. In fact, our solar installed capacity has increased by 1,000 times in the last 10 years. And finally, it moves me to the last alphabet of India opportunity is digitization. And what do I mean by that? Please have a look at the pyramid, or rather the triangle. This is the India stack. This is a game changer responsible for financial and technology inclusion of India. This is based on the concept of paperless, presence-less, paperless, cashless, and consent-less. So what do I mean by that? We believe in Holy Trinity, and our Holy Trinity here is 1 billion people biometrics, done. 1 billion mobile phones, done. And 1 billion bank accounts. In the last 6 years, we have opened 385 million new bank accounts. And why is it relevant? Well, we have transferred $100 billion of benefits through these bank accounts, which has cut down on corruption. We have leapfrogged from credit cards. After 70 years, we had 50 million credit card holders. But now we do over 1 billion transactions a month. In fact, the largest mobile wallet company has 150 million active users, over 16 million merchants spread across 2,000 towns. And why we've been able to do that, and I'm sure it will be covered later, is the growth in our mobile users. Today, there are 600 million users accessing internet over mobile. And our usage of data has increased by 44 times in the last 5 years. Now, when we talk about opportunity, there is a small matter of taxation. We've done significant reforms. We've reduced our corporate taxation by about from 35 to about 25%. In fact, if you start new manufacturing before 2023, it goes down to as low as net effective about 17%. Not only this, we've also reformed our indirect taxation. Indian now is finally one unified market. We want to cut down our logistics costs as a percentage of GDP from 14 odd percent to 10%. We're bringing about more warehouses efficiency. Sizes of warehouses is increasing from 5,000 square meters to 50,000 square meters. And we're cutting down on lorry time. With that, I come to the end of my second section of the presentation, where I spoke about India opportunity, CFID, consumption, formalization, infrastructure, digitization, and the change in tax reforms. Now I move very quickly to the last part of my presentation, which is reforms. 4 L's. First is laws. We have repealed 1,000 laws. we bringing everything on a platform, digital platform, so that there is transparency, there is predictability, there is less manual intervention, and it results in reduced cost of compliance as well as reduced time of compliance required. Second is we are bringing about liquidity reforms, important in current scenario. We are very prudent in managing our fiscal deficit. So what we've offered is liquidity to those businesses. And there's about $40 billion of collateral-free loans available. Then there's a reduction in bank lending rate. So we've not thrown money. We've been sensible about it, where we know liquidity is the biggest challenge. And the two other reforms I quickly want to touch upon are labor and land. We have a plethora of labor laws, over 200 central and state labor laws. Now, we are codifying 44 central labor laws into 4 codes. In fact, states are competing amongst themselves to offer a more conducive labor environment. Same thing for land. Land acquisition in India was suffered from lack of transparency, convoluted, expensive. $100,000 an acre for industrial land is not uncommon. But now we are having an online repository of land, 30 days approval. If approval is not given, it's deemed approval. And if you look at my next slide, we have 44 odd industrial clusters, and we have 2 million square meters of industrial space ready for possession in the next 8 to 10 weeks. With that, I come to the end of my presentation, and I show this slide, which gives you an idea of the marquee foreign companies in India, and we would love to see more Swiss companies. Thank you for your patience. Over to you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta, for your comprehensive presentation, setting the ground for the webinar which follows us ahead. Let me now move on to the next section, which is guest remarks made by our first guest of honor today, Mr. Phil Reich, President, Swiss Indian Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Phil Reich, may I request you to please come on screen for making the guest remarks.
Everyone, Mr. Singh,
welcome.
On behalf of the Swiss Indian Chamber of Commerce, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar about the Indian electronics sector and how Swiss companies can benefit, and Indian companies alike mutually benefit from this sector as part of India's initiatives, Make in India, but generally bilateral trade and investment cooperations between Switzerland and India. If I may just briefly introduce the Chamber of Commerce to you all, participants at this webinar. Our Chamber of Commerce is the bilateral chamber between Switzerland and India, has been alive and kicking for 35 years now. In India, we have kind of a sister organization, also more than 10 years old. And we have a presence in the main business hubs in Switzerland and in India. And we work together regularly and intensely with our public and private stakeholders, including the governments of India, of Switzerland, the authorities, and public and private organizations, including Swissmem. My dear colleague, Mr. Keller, will speak to you shortly thereafter. And we have about 400 members in total in Switzerland and in India. And our goal is really to help our members and generally companies doing business in India and Indian companies doing business in Switzerland to enable them to cooperate, to find the right partners. So we are door openers, we are networkers, we are the acknowledged, unique stakeholder partner for the Swiss Indian governments, the embassies, consulates, and relevant authorities whenever it concerns bilateral trade and investment relations at governmental level, but also in terms of enabling events and webinars, seminars, workshops, business meetings, gatherings, whenever there are official visits, both ways, to enable Swiss and Indian businesses to interact with those representatives. So you're most welcome to share our platform, to be part of our networking and maintain meaningful relationships with us, with your peers here in Switzerland and in India. And last but not least, currently, if I may conclude my introduction by saying that we know that in a very special situation right now and going forward. In my professional context, we look at 3 R's, which is 1, resilience. In many countries, we are already in the recovery stage, but ahead of us lies the renewal stage. And we believe, as a Chamber of Commerce, that India has a lot to offer in the future. It is difficult right now for India, but India is a promising economy with all the advantages and opportunities that my colleague and friend, Mr. Gupta, has just mentioned, and that you will hear about more specifically right afterwards. So we would like to invite you to engage with us, with our partners, with everyone that will be able to help you make your way to India and from India to Switzerland and be part of this journey, because there is a renewal ahead and India is very much on the global map. So please be welcome to the India story. Many thanks and have a great weekend thereafter.
Thank you, Mr. Reich, for those kind words and for the commitment of the Swiss Indian Chamber of Commerce towards strengthening India-Switzerland relationship. Let me move on to the next section of this webinar by thanking the Electronics and Computer Software Export Promotion Council for coordinating the presence of very eminent speakers during these course of the webinars we've had. Amongst these eminent speakers is Mr. Vinod Sharma, former chairman and executive member of the Electronics and Computer Software Export Promotion Council, who is with us today and will be making a presentation on the Indian electronics sector. May I please request you, Mr. Vinod Sharma, to please come on screen and make the presentation. Thank you. Thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Singh, thank you very much for this opportunity. All of us and my colleagues at ESC are indeed very privileged to be with you this afternoon, this evening. Also, greetings on the World Environment Day today. We are more and more recognizing the fact that we didn't get it wrong. We got it very wrong for many years, and it's time to correct our course. Electronics as a sector presents us with a lot of opportunities to correct the course, not only to better our lives, and as was pointed out by Mr. Gupta in his presentation very correctly, lots of those, whether it's infrastructure, it's inclusion, it's consumption, can, and even the Holy Trinity that he mentioned, has its roots a lot in electronics hardware and in software. What I'd like to present to you today is, of course, these are challenging times. We are all just coming back from the lockdown. My own business, which is based out of the Delhi NCR region in Noida, which is one of the electronics manufacturing hubs. My own company manufactures a component called capacitors. I don't often talk about my company, but the relevance of doing that today is that we manufacture a component which since 2005, under the WTO agreement ITA 1, has been at 0 basics customs duty, which means that all capacitors that are produced in the last 15 years and sold around the world are globally cost competitive. Obviously, they are competitive in terms of technology and reliability, but it's a proof that in India, we can manufacture fairly high value-added components. This is, of course, medium technology, what we do, at prices that can compete with the best in the world, including China. We do now see an opportunity for, as Mr. Tarun, I think right in the beginning mentioned, our services has really had a very successful run, even as a contributor to our GDP. Manufacturing is lagged behind, and one of the reasons for that, I think, I speak as a businessman, not as a government spokesperson. So the truth is that getting manufacturing right anywhere requires all elements of the economy to work together, whether that's all factors, whether it's land, it's labor, it's the laws, it's the liquidity, the bureaucracy, our intent, the vision of what we want to do. And we've not got this puzzle together for a long time. I'm very happy to report that as a businessman, I feel extremely confident that over the last 6-7 years, this is beginning to change. Whether it's the availability of energy, the cost of land, the labor laws, as were already mentioned, we are all getting our act together. And my feeling is that the success that we've had, as my colleagues in the software have been reporting in, as chairman of Export Council for both electronics and software, that is one of our large exporting sectors. However, in hardware, we have often said that we missed the bus. Very, very happy that we seem to be getting a second opportunity to get onto that bus. And I'm very confident that my colleagues and myself, we are working very hard on it. Let me present to you something far more relevant for today, because these are, as you can see on the screens, these are 3 schemes that were announced just day before yesterday by our Minister for Electronics. So the government, through the crisis, has also worked on making sure that these opportunities just get better and better for all of us. Before I go there, sorry. So if you want to take a look at just the numbers, there is one number which is not on the screen, but it's good to remember, is that the total world of electronics, when I talk electronics, largely hardware, and some embedded software within that hardware, is about $2.1 trillion. And so that gets you to a per capita electronic consumption in the world of about, divide that by 7 billion people, so that's about $300 per capita. In India, as you can see, that we are still scratching the surface of that, because we are at about $70 per capita at the moment. So we have a 4 to 4.5 times catching up to do. We believe, along with the government in India, that this catching up, that is a 4x growth, is something that we are looking at to happen within the next 4 to 5 years. As I speak, in the last 6 years, our CAGR, a compound average growth rate, is already at about 25% in terms of the production. And at imports, as you can see, it's at about 11%. At exports, we've grown at about 10% during this period, which has not been the most spectacular period for our economy as a whole for several reasons. So you can see that from a production of about $29 billion in 2014-15, within 5 years, in the 5th year, we've already gone to about $70 billion. I think primarily the reason is the amount of focus that we've received from the government from a policy-making perspective, and that has caused a lot of enthusiasm, of course, in businessmen like myself. We have grown from about 1.3% of our contribution to the global electronics business to about 3%. Within these 5 years, we've doubled it, as I said, a little more than double. Our aim is to get to as high as 8 to 9% within the next 4 years. Obviously, this, as you can see on the right, this whole growth is led largely by mobile phones. But I would also say that it's also happening in the areas of consumer electronics, industrial electronics, computer hardware, strategic electronics, defense largely, and electronic components that supports all of them. There was a national policy for electronics that was released in 2012. That got us to the figures that you already saw in the previous slide. In 2019, we've embarked on the second version of the policy. It's called the NPE 2019. And part of the NPE 2019 is the 3 schemes that I would like to talk about today. The aim of those schemes is obviously to make sure that we are a global hub for mobiles and component manufacturing in India. We are already the second largest assembler of mobile phones in the world. This just happened in the last 4 years. 5 years ago, we had 2 factories assembling mobile phones, and today we have a total of 276, if I'm not mistaken, 276 factories. A lot of them doing mobile phones. Almost all brands are now being assembled in India, but several of them also are supply chain partners like myself to these large mobile assemblers. The idea is also to attract global lead firms along with their supply chains to India, and finally make in India for the world, which will include exports. The domestic, this is a little bit of a detail into 3 sectors, and one is the mobile handsets. As you can see, we've gone from about $60 million to 250, almost 4 times growth. And here we have achieved a domestic value addition close to 20% now. When we started, it was only 5%. It was largely packaging. But now we've come to a stage where we're beginning to do the assembled PCBs in India for mobile phones. What we are still missing is a lot of key components. We definitely don't do the actives at the moment, and there's a new policy that we are working with the government to bring in that bit. But except for the actives, the semiconductors, the rest of it is very much there today. The second large vertical is that of consumer electronics, you may call it LCD, LED TVs as one particular segment, one particular product group, but also add to that set-top boxes. And that alone is a digitization of 25 million households that happened in the last 3-4 years, and another 20 million that will get added in the next 3 to 4 years. Here we have also a value addition at the moment of 12 to 15%. And finally, the LED or lighting products. This has come to a figure of about 2 billion. We are the second largest producer of LED lighting today, next to China. And we do believe that in this area, we are fully vertically integrated. Even the assembly of LED chips is beginning to happen in India now. Except for fab, we can do everything in India. So here the value addition is much higher. It's not on the slide, but it's about 40% at the moment. The emerging verticals, auto electronics, I don't have enough time on this presentation to go into each detail, but you can imagine the kind of electric vehicle, whether it's two-wheelers, three-wheelers. We are the largest producer of two-wheelers in the world. And the electrification of this, given the fact that our cities suffer with pollution, given the fact that the rising population, as was shown in Mr. Tarun's pyramid structure, there are lots of people on the bottom of the pyramid and middle of the pyramid who are aspiring, and they still are not looking at a four-wheeler, but a two-wheeler as their main means of transport. The electrification of that alone is an extremely exciting opportunity, whether that's motor controllers, motors, chargers, etc. In fact, my own company is diversified and done 3 joint ventures in the area of electric vehicles in the last 2 years. Medical electronics, we have set up a full cluster in the east of India, only doing medical electronics. Almost 70 companies are already there, making different parts and some very sophisticated medical equipment. And we think that's an area that is going to be, again, a large vertical for us. Industrial electronics was always there. Some Swiss companies have been in India for a long time. And we think that that is going up because our whole capital equipment industry is also now beginning to look up. Strategic electronics, and India's recent call up, Honorable Prime Minister's call for vocal for local and getting self-reliant, not to be mistaken as closing in or protecting our economy, is this whole area of producing, making for defense in India. And finally, telecom, we are the cheapest call rate and the cheapest broadband economy in the world. And obviously that means that we can do a lot of telecom equipment. There are lots of Indian companies doing it. And we are very glad that a company like Ericsson, for example, has been here for over 100 years. The growth in mobile manufacturing, as I mentioned, from 2, we've gone over to 200 now. We've clocked close to 300 million phones, and that's about 30 billion. And this has happened just in the last 4 or 5 years. Coming to these schemes, which I think are extremely exciting, there are 3 that were released now, and gives you also a flavor of the kind of thinking going on in the policy making, which I've been fortunate to be associated with 2. So one is a large-scale mobile manufacturing scheme, a production-linked incentive, which I will, in the next slide, tell you that it's basically an incentive that the government of India is willing to give every manufacturer of mobile phones in India, whether they are doing it for the domestic tariff area, the markets in India, which is very large and is growing, but also for exports. And this is to the tune of between 6% and 4% of your turnover. And that is largely to compensate what we believe are the disabilities of making in India, which whether that's the cost of energy, cost of finance, cost of logistics, the government is very cognizant of that, is holding our hand as business today and saying over a period of time, it will start with 6% and go down to 4% in 5 years. Because the impact of these disabilities is also abating. As you heard earlier, electricity is now surplus. At one point in time, we all had to have our own backup power. The new clusters that are coming up don't need backup power, and that's been taken care of. The roads are getting better, the ports are getting better, the airports are getting better. The second is what I acronymed as SPECS, a scheme for promotion of manufacturing of components and semiconductors. And this is, again, a capital subsidy scheme where 25% of the cost of plant and machinery is being borne by the government of India. And the last one is a scheme on electronic manufacturing clusters. It's 2.0 because there was already a cluster scheme earlier. In fact, we have, as Electronics Component Association, made the first cluster in India, getting together 26 companies to begin to produce in India. In one cluster, the idea was to make manufacturing very competitive by coming together as companies. And these are all SME companies. The second, the 2.0 was just announced recently. The idea is that the state governments, along with the central government in India, begin to create what we call plug-and-play infrastructure for units to either relocate from other parts of the world or set up greenfield projects. As you can see there, the 5-year outcomes are very ambitious. We're looking at an additional production of $106 billion worth of electronics, of which about $77 billion we believe will be exported. And this will create an employment directly of 1 million people. As you could see also that the total incentives that the government has promised us about $6.7 billion. So these are not small figures for a country like India. But I'm very glad that this is coming at a time where we genuinely believe, for several reasons, whether it's labor cost, whether it's our maturity as a manufacturing economy, and it's also our network with the world, we believe that this is a very, very good time to be doing this. As I said, in the PLI scheme, the incentive is of 4 to 6% spread over a period of 5 years. This will be given on incremental turnovers every year, using year zero as your base year, which means for 5 years you continue to get this. This is just a slide to say that the portal is open even for invitations since day before yesterday. I will skip this one. These spec scheme, the targeted components, as you can see, are active and passive components, semiconductors, ATMPs, and specialized sub-assemblies. I will not get into the figures, but again, an extremely interesting scheme with 25% money being given by the government towards our plant and machinery investments. The portal for that, and that's just a glimpse of that. And finally, the cluster scheme, and that's the pictures of our Minister, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, who announced this, and the Minister of State, Mr. Sanjay Dokle. What is the whole idea? So as we said, that this is expansion of the manufacturer base. I think we are learning from our colleagues in China, Korea, and Taiwan, and may I say even Japan earlier. We are looking at a high employment generation out of these schemes. A foreign exchange saving, because as you could see, my first slide, we are still importing a very large amount of electronics. In fact, next to oil, the second largest import we have as a sector is currently electronics. And obviously that's something that we can do, and that's why these schemes are being launched at this point of time, with an idea to be able to save some of that. The idea is to add value addition. This is a supply chain driven industry, so at no point of time are we going to say that we are going to be 100% reliant only on Indian supply chains. The idea is to build a robust supply chain here, but even at the best, we believe that we will be doing about 40% value addition. 60% dependence will stay with components elsewhere in the world. And I think that's, so people talk of deglobalization and decentralization. I believe this is a sector where we'll continue to rely on a very strong network of supply chains across the world. And finally, all this is also leading to a very important perspective from a digital, everything we're talking about is digitization. The World Bank rankings that you saw, where we've improved on our ease of doing business, are largely based on transparency, on digitization, on portalization of everything, so that it's a no-touch transaction with our governments. As Mr. Tarun, I think, rightly mentioned in the beginning, there are lots of applications, and we are not very well known for a smooth, transparent, or let's say easygoing bureaucracy. But that's changing. I can tell you as a businessman, that is because there is no contact. There's a single window. I apply on a portal. In 30 days, either I get the approval or it's deemed to be approved. So things are moving in that direction very, very quickly. You can see from this chart what is very interesting. This is actually a government presentation. It's the first time in my 20 years of policy advocacy that I have used a government presentation to make my presentation. And the reason is that I find that finally, after 20 years, I feel genuinely aligned with the government. And you can see here that each of these schemes gives us an impact on our disability, and overall 5.9 to 10.7%, almost 11% of disability, the impact of disability is being addressed here, which makes me as a business person anywhere from 6 to 11% more competitive than I was before these schemes were launched. And that was already reasonably good, given the fact that the factory of the world, China, is getting expensive, is rethinking what they want to be engaged with, is moving up higher higher in the value chain. I think this is a very, very opportune moment for you to look at India, for us to look at India together. Wherever large companies want to do this, they can do it on their own. There is 100% free FDI in this sector, except for some neighboring countries, which was recently brought in. And for most of the sector, I would say. And wherever it's a smaller company, a medium-sized company out of Switzerland that is probably not confident or wants to use local expertise to help them, lots of my colleagues within ESC are ready to do joint ventures, have the experience and the expertise of running companies in this country for more than 3 decades, and would be more than willing to participate. I would stop with that. There are lots of these companies which are EMS companies, electronic product companies, and component companies that are already present in India. The next time I make a presentation, it is my hope and wish that this Make in India Lion will also be filled with lots of medium-sized companies from around the world, because I think it makes solid business sense. Thank you very much. Dr. Singh, over to you.
Sharma, for that extensive briefing, providing us a very comprehensive overview of the sector, highlighting the opportunities which are available for Swiss, and for giving us so many insights. The program MISSP focuses on the Swiss SMEs, and I'm sure that next time we'll have a few of those Swiss SMEs also reflected in the Make in India line. Thank you for joining us. There are a few questions, but I'll pose them to you during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So with that, I will now move on to the next session of the webinar, where we have our second guest of honor with us, Mr. Raul Keller, Secretary General, Swissmem. The embassy has had a wonderful cooperation with Swissmem, and we've organized a number of events together. Welcome, Mr. Keller, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dr. Singh, distinguished guests. Good afternoon, and for those who are in India, good evening. My name is Raul Keller. I'm now trying to put you the presentation on the screen. I hope you can see that now. Right, okay. Thank you very much for being here. I'm engaged with Swissmem. Swissmem is the largest industry association in Switzerland. And MEM means mechanical, electrical engineering, and metal industry. So that's our portfolio. This next slide. We actually divided the industry, the Swiss industry, in 27 technical divisions. I just put a sample here on screen. One you can see on your left, the machine tool machines actually. We have tooling. These are the topic which we talked today about semiconductor and components, electronics, but also system integration, and for whole system, like in the train manufacturing, that's Stadler Rail, for example, precision foundries. And the space technology division, which I lead, which is pretty interesting and high-tech, and I love to engage here with that division. So the key figures shortly. Our industry has a turnover of about 88 billion Swiss franc. Swiss franc is about US dollar plus minus 5%. I think that you can say it's about 1-to-1. It's easier to read. Exports nearly 70 billion Swiss francs, and 28% of all export comes from the MEM industry, from the engineering, metal, and electrical engineering industry. So the export share is about 80%, and share of GDP 7%. We employ via our companies roughly 325,000 employers in Switzerland, and we have another 580,000 employees which are abroad or internationally in our locations in the companies. Also the training, about 20,000 places in Switzerland, which we train young people to be fascinated and to have a workplace in the industry. We go to the next topic. It's about third, nearly maybe a quarter of all exports leaving Switzerland is either mechanical engineering, precision instrument, and here electrical engineering, electronics, metalworking and vehicles. That's the portfolio I just mentioned. That's about a fourth. And obviously now in this critical time, it's probably difficult to export anyhow. I mean, the Procurement Index shows everything red. That means surely that supply chains are interrupted, and our businesses, not only ours, but especially businesses in Europe and the world are not able to deliver, sometimes even not able to produce because the demand has been stopped. You can see here India, I mean, it is also very low, but actually still blue. I mean, it looks like it turns to the better. But China is obviously the lead. They turn back to over 50. That means they're starting to grow again. We are in Switzerland. We're looking at Germany heavily. You can see here indexes of IFO. Which we don't need to understand in this session now, but it is important to understand that Switzerland, the industry depends very heavily on the German market. We are the largest supplier in machine tools for Germany. So if Germany is not able to produce and export, we're suffering obviously as well. And you can see that on the next slide here, I put it in red. These are the countries, the markets actually, which we export MEM goods. And I marked here Germany. You can see the share of our exports to Germany is about nearly 25%. A quarter of all MEM industry exports goes to Germany. So our biggest, most important partner or country shows clearly a lack of growth from the first quarter this year. You see January to March 2020. And another one, it's obviously India, which we're talking about today. I mean, the shares are very much lower, so the impact is not that high, obviously, if we face difficulties in the growth. Then you look at the turnover. This is the turnover development. Actually, it's the growth. You can see here a negative growth, obviously always compared to the last year. We say that the first quarter actually was not that bad, of course, because we calculate January, February, and March as a business result, and I mean the impact of COVID-19 is definitely coming in the second quarter, in the third quarter this year, where we will see much worse figures, and you can see here in this slide. That electrical and electronic engineering, we are already 4.3% below the last quarter in growth than last year, and that is a turnover and in export, let's say export value is about 2.7 billion Swiss francs. The expectation of the next 12 months, you can see Q1, the red one, I mean, 70% of the companies expecting worse figures, order intakes of the next 12 months. That's obviously clear. Just only 20% say the business will be the same, and 10% say they will grow. Of course, there are some companies, especially in the medical field, in the food field, and certain electronic companies which produce medical equipment are growing, obviously, in this difficult time. If you look and compare the margins, you can see four groups. There's the first group, the second, the third, and the fourth group. The second and the first and the second group indicates margins, EBIT margin, which are lower than 0 and not more than 5%. So from minus to plus 5%, they are considered unsatisfactory margins. So if you calculate these two columns together, that's at the actual situation, 38 plus 34%, so that over 70% of the companies have negative margin or unsatisfactory margins. So this is a pretty heavy impact of the actual situation. And you can see here usual industry margin from 5.1 to 8%. That's more project margin, and a very good margin on the product side. You can see 8.1 to 15%, but there have only 17% have told us from 375 companies that they have a positive, very good margin. The expectation for the next 18 months in the industry, you can see that dip. So a recovery is at the moment, and hopefully it's like that, not that we hit by a second wave. It is before end of 2020. It's supposed to have an increase. Obviously, it's like a U shape. Hopefully, it's a V shape. But I mean, that's like looking at a glass ball. At the moment, we expect, let's say, a turn of to the better at the end of the year. If you look at the India development, we see exports and imports to India. That from the last 10 years, you can see here the trend. It's not positive, unfortunately. The imports from India to Switzerland is positive. I'm always talking about the MEM industry, right? Not any other, let's say, portfolio which we have in Switzerland. It's just the MEM, the metal engineering and electronics engineering industry. So you have a negative trend up to 19 and a positive trend in the imports from India to Switzerland. Now I got some figures for the electrical engineering and electronics. You can see it's very low. Actually, it's not that high. 41 million Swiss franc for the first quarter. So you can multiply that by 4. You're supposed to have a target about 200 million exports to India, and imports, it's about 4 times less. So it's about 40 million, which we import from India. What means for us electrical engineering and electronics, you can see here the technical listing. We talk especially the power generation, electric motors, this 11.3 million, and it is divided in alternators, generators, transformers, DC generators, but also telecommunication equipment, electric and electronic articles. Sometimes you have to be careful. You cannot calculate all together. They're listed in a tree. So it's electronic parts, switch gears, medium voltage, low voltage gears, cable wirings and stuff. That's for us electronics, and not in detail. Maybe capacitors we have seen, heard from our previous speaker. It's more these groups which I just explained to you. Then if you look at the curve from the last 10 years on the electrical engineering and electronics export with India, this is the export curve, and this is the import curve. Export means from Switzerland to India, import from India to Switzerland. And the trend, it's definitely fine, it's upward, but of course there's a lot of, let's say, opportunities to grow that sector. If you look at comparison to MEA, Middle East and Asia, India is on third place. That's it's very nice to see. China's leading at the total, let's say, export to Middle East and Asia is 2.7 billion Swiss francs, and India here the third place. And the next one, it's the imports to Switzerland compared to Middle East and Asian countries in 2019. There we have a lot of improvement, let's say, in front of us. Let's say, pretty positive opportunities to, let's say, import electronics from India to Switzerland. The last slide, I just want to conclude. I mean, we stepped a little back from the electronics part. So you can see what Swissmem actually demands from economic policies. We need to strengthen the industries right after this crisis with these 5 different positions. First, we need to abolish industrial tariffs. We say, okay, that's one part of a free trade agreement, right? But only one side. We need to increase innovative ability, support innovation, and companies that they are able to innovate in this difficult time. We need to improve market access. That's definitely the free trade agreement, which is here on first place. And then, of course, there are other market access activities which we need, because Switzerland is of course, a very small market, and we need the world. We need to access to the world in order to grow. That gives us the expected growth. Then continue digitization. Definitely, it's also not digitization only; it's also 5G. Which is important, infrastructure, then the government topics in digitalization, and making the best use of public procurement. That's offset business, especially for fighter jets and defense equipment, which we need to optimize it. So these are our 5 economic policy demands which we have to our government, and we hope that we can get out of the crisis. And thank you very much for this time with me and this presentation.
For making my presentation from the Swissmem perspective and the India-Switzerland opportunity which exists and is being utilized, and the potential. With those words, let me now move on to the next section of this webinar, which is looking at the sector from the legal and tax perspective. So may I now invite Ms. Ritika Arora from the Legal and Tax Partner from MISSP, Rodel Partner, to please come and make a presentation. Thank you. Ms. Arora.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Welcome, everyone, and thank you to the esteemed panelists for giving an excellent oversight into this sector. With this, now I would like to take everyone through the legal framework in India for companies looking to enter into the Indian market, and my colleague Priyanka will take you through the tax regime there. Now, of course, we've already noticed this from the past presentations, that one of the largest electronics market in the world is in India, and it is anticipated to be reaching this huge figure by 2025. Now, another thing which is interesting is that 100% FDI is permitted under the automatic route, thereby attracting lucrative investments. But here one needs to be mindful of where the transaction is being routed from. If there is any investment that is being made by a country which is sharing a border with India, then there is a requirement to seek prior government approval, irrespective of the sector. So this forms a critical part in the transaction structuring model. Now, quickly moving on to the next slide, what you have in front of you are various options that are available to make an inroad into the Indian market. For example, you can have the presence of the foreign entity in India through a licensor office, a project office, a branch office, or in the form of an incorporated entity, which can be a subsidiary or a joint venture. Now, the pros and cons, the permissible activities, the scope of services, etc., that can be rendered varies, as does the tax implications. So it is very important to have a proper structuring analysis done before making an entry into the Indian market. Needless to say that one of the most commonly opted models that we note here is in the form of a subsidiary here, which allows you to have a full scope of business. Taking you through the next slide here, we have set out the various verticals that need to be looked into. Of course, India is a land full of laws. A lot is being done. There is a lot of ease of doing business is positively being reflected in reformation in the legal sector as well. But here we set out some key things that need to be kept in mind. Now, setting up is fairly easy and centralized. Everything is moving to a digital platform. We have a fast track incorporation model where, in our experience, we've seen incorporation certificates being granted within a 2 or 3 day time period, subject to, of course, having all the documents ready and in place. Your tax registrations, employment registrations can all happen in the same time along with your incorporation process. Opening of a bank account is fairly simple now. Now, sector specific, you need to also, apart from the fact that I've already mentioned on the FDI 100% permission, you also have to look at the Information Technology Act, read with specific rules, specifically focusing on the electronic sector. Now, coming to law enforcement, foreign judgments in India would require some sort of extra effort in the form of an execution proceeding or civil suit before they can be recognized by the Indian courts. So in all the contract documents, it is important to ensure that you make a proper choice of your law and place of jurisdiction. We have a fairly advanced arbitration system continuously being amended and being brought up to speed with the global practices. So this is another dispute resolution mechanism that we are seeing being implemented in practice. Insolvency and bankruptcy law has already been touched upon. So without going into the specifics here, what we have noticed is that it's continuously progressing. There are many developments and it's coming out to be a very successful and powerful law to ensure insolvency and liquidation process happens in a speedy manner. Labor laws, of course, India is a land of labor. We had several laws at the central and state level, but now we are moving to codification of these laws, of uniform laws across states and at the central level as well. So all of these factors have definitely facilitated ease in actually entering the Indian market and being able to sustain and survive in the Indian market and making it at par with the global standards. So this is an update from the legal side. Now over to my colleague Priyanka, who will take you through the tax vertical here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to the participants from Switzerland and good evening to the ones from India. I'm Priyanka and I'll be taking you through some of the tax updates. Most of these points have actually been touched upon by Mr. Gupta in his earlier presentation and also by Mr. Sharma. So I'll keep it really brief, and also I believe we are running short of time. To give you a quick overview of the tax regime in India, the framework has direct tax and the indirect tax regime. Within the realm of direct tax, we have the National Indian Tax Law, which is the Indian Income Tax Act, also coupled with the double taxation avoidance agreements, which play an important role in governing the tax provisions for non-residents, investors, basically. So we have an agreement. So India has an agreement with Switzerland, which seeks to levy beneficial tax rates of withholding for royalties, fees for technical services, and so on and so forth. We also have the transfer pricing regulation, which is a compliance requirement to be followed between the parent company, Swiss in this case, and the Indian subsidiary. This is now moving towards at par with global standards and the norms laid down by the Organization for Economic Commerce and Development, the OECD. The next in force is the equalization levy, where the scope has been expanded from April 2020. Within indirect taxes, we have the customs regulation and the foreign trade policy, which governs imports and exports within and out of the country, and then the much talked about goods and services tax, or the GST. Moving ahead, these are some general updates for the area of direct tax. Mr. Tarun Gupta had already spoken about how the tax rates were slashed from 35% to 22%, and for manufacturing companies, in fact, to 15%, bringing down the effective tax rate by about almost 15%. This makes India a very lucrative destination for investments from outside the country, especially because our tax rates are now aligned with most of the APAC lower tax regime countries like Singapore and other countries like Taiwan, Vietnam, etc. In fact, it is lower than the global average as well, which is 23% right now. The other big change that was brought about from April 2020 was the abolishing of the dividend distribution tax. Earlier, this was actually paid by the Indian subsidiary. Now, this tax is being levied or is imposed in the hands of the foreign investors or any other investor for that matter, the recipient of the dividend. This has two benefits on the foreign investor. One is the tax treaty regime that we spoke about, the favorable rates could now be accessed. And secondly, foreign tax credits, that is taxes withheld in the country, could now be creditable in the home country. Like in this case, a Swiss parent will be able to now claim a credit of the dividend, the tax on dividends paid in India. This will bring down the dividend tax to a great extent from the 20% to probably to 10%, or depending on the treaty rates, to even lower than that if a credit is claimed. The other change that was brought about from April 2020 that we spoke about was the enhancement of the equalization levy. Earlier, the levy was restricted to advertisement. Now it has been expanded to an e-commerce operator who sells goods online or who provides services online. The other updates are more generic updates, and to keep in line with the Organization for Economic Commerce and Development, the OECD measures taken for base erosion and profit shifting. The next slide here is a slide specific to the electronic sector. As such, because we saw that the country has now sought to reduce the rates for manufacturing, there are no specific investments in the tax realm, at least for the electronic sector. However, a number of incentives are available as far as research and development expenses are concerned, including up to 150% of the total expenses incurred for in-house R&D. There are certain weighted deductions also available to research payments made to IITs and national laboratories, which is specified in this regard. An additional employee cost is also available as a deduction. As far as GST and customs is concerned, there was a significant realignment of the custom duties in the budget of 2020 to promote the Make in India initiative and also the electronic sector. For instance, the custom duty rates on components used in, say, for example, manufacture of a mobile, like the motor ringers, displays, and touch pads, etc., were now levied so as to curb the imports and to enhance the Make in India or manufacturing within India. Also, there was Mr. Sharma spoke about the electrical vehicles. There have been certain incentives granted to individuals who procure these vehicles. So in all, this is a short update from my end. If there are any questions, we can take it up in the Q&A session. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Dr. Singh.
For a presentation from the legal and tax perspective. We're running short of time, but given that this is the last webinar, I'll take the liberty of taking us to the Q&A session. And the general format is that I ask questions in the sequence in which the presenters have appeared. So I would first request Mr. Gupta to please come on the screen. There's a question inquiring, saying that the industry ecosystem, apart from trained engineers, also requires a skilled workforce. Technicians. Are there any specific vocational colleges in India who may have collaboration with other such colleges from different countries? Yeah.
So first of all, I think we hold our hands up that we have not been very good in our vocational education system, and we and the government of India's initiatives, including with the Swiss VET, are a step in that direction. And I think that in the electronic sector, we need to emulate what the automotive sector has done. And I cannot know offhand what are the colleges specifically, but clearly we already see some of the clusters where our electronics industry is coming. Those vocational colleges trying to up their game, but what we lack is the trainer themselves. I think we could learn a lot, and the collaboration there, which our embassy and the government is progressing, is how to train the trainer in these aspects.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Let me now move on to Mr. Vinod Sharma. There are, I think, two questions I could identify. There would be more, but I do not have that much time. The first question inquires about the status of fabless semiconductor manufacturing in India and any specific government initiatives to promote this, please.
Sure. Before I come to the fabulous just a supplement to the answer that Tarunji gave. On the vocational training. What we've also done, as you probably are aware, that there was a National Skill Development Council formed 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And within that, sector skill councils were also formed. So I am on the board of what we call the Electronic Sector Skill Council, which has actually been formed and is owned by 5 sector associations within electronics. So as we speak, the qualification packs, the testing procedure, and the certification procedure is all in place for as high as 300 skill sets at the moment. And we are now upping our game and taking it to what we call level 5 and level 6 training. And I know that the Swiss model is extremely good, and it's something we can learn from. So I will also ask my colleagues there to be in touch with you through your office with this model there.
Yeah.
So now coming to the fabulous, yes, you're absolutely right. The truth is that a lot of fabs and also I would say designer firms, whether it's a ST Micro kind of firm or an Infineon or you would say Texas Instruments, they already have their design houses in India in very large numbers, and that's something that we're very proud of. Specific policy for fabless is under formulation right now, and my guess is that in 2 to 3 months you will begin to hear about it. There is a specific policy coming for fabless design houses in India, which will be incentivized to some extent.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Sharma. There's one more question on, that's a generic question on the R&D, the innovation aspect of the existing in the electronic sector in India, and also on the IPR protections, which again is a major thing when it comes to discussions between India and Switzerland.
So first on the IPR protection, my personal take is, and I know, I'm not a legal person in that sense, but we are completely in line with the global norms on IPR, the laws on IPR. Besides that, I would say even the culture of intellectual property in a country is extremely important. It's not only the laws. And from a cultural perspective, I think we have a lot of respect for IP, and I don't think even medium-scale companies, forget the large-scale companies, would actually work on infringing a right or infringing a copyright thing. However, the laws are there to protect anybody that is done. So, in fact, the 3 collaborations I mentioned earlier, one is with a company in Finland, another one with Korea, and a third is a British one. One of the reasons they chose us as partners was because they felt not just Indian laws, but also the way, as a small company, a medium company, the way we handle intellectual property and technology is something that they were very comfortable with. Your question, the other question on R&D, yes, this is an area that as a country we are definitely lagging behind at the moment. If you look at as a percentage spend of companies, so a lot of R&D has happened in the public sector, in the government sector, in the academic institutions, and I think that's a gap that we realize that in the private institutions, either it is less, definitely much lesser than what it should be, but also that we are not very well connected with our academic institutions and with what lies in the government institutions. Yeah. And that's, I think, a work in process. A lot of work happening in that area as we speak. Yeah. And R&D, from an incentive perspective, you had a weighted deduction on our tax, which was mentioned, I think, by the other speaker today. It's at 150% today. But I completely agree that that's an area, and I think that's an area of complementarity with the Swiss industry. I believe you're strong on R&D, your spend on R&D is much more. So let it be designs of Swiss being made in India. I think that could be quite an interesting combination.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you for being with us as a guest speaker. Let me now move on to Mr. Phil Reich, the first guest of honor we had today. There's a question, which I understand, would have been asked to you many times. That do you feel that that India-Switzerland free trade area will lead to a more diversified India-Switzerland trade? It particularly says that largely if you see it's focused on bullion as of now. So any comments or thoughts on that?
Yes, indeed, it is a very common question. I think I can refer directly also to my colleague, Mr. Keller, and his remarks. I mean, we are fully aligned there. It is clearly our ambition, and we're really kind of advocating here in Switzerland with you, with the Indian government, to have a free trade agreement in place as soon as possible. And maybe it would sound not the right time, but we believe it's even more the right time going ahead, because also in India's interest to have at least certain, probably not the large type of free trade, because the larger the regions and the more powerful the counterparts, speaking of US or even EU, of course, the more difficult and political it gets. But if you have a small trade area like EFTA, which includes important countries, in particular also Switzerland, where Switzerland can offer a lot, and this is very much a sector we just talked about, to help India in promoting and in kind of implementing its strategies, make in India, and with high precision technology in various sectors, and in particular also in the electronic sector. Yes, wherever we speak to Swiss companies, they would tell us of course, it would make a difference to have a free trade agreement in place, and it would allow that diversification of trade, which would be mutually beneficial for Switzerland to export and or to produce, to find collaborations. Intellectual property was mentioned. That is indeed an important factor from a Swiss perspective, but in particular also to help India.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Reich. Thank you for participating in this webinar today. I move on to the second guest of honor. We have with us today Mr. Raul Keller. There's a question. It's more on the operational side. It says that they're a firm which work with electromechanical, defense, semiconductor, electric panel industry, and the company has latest technology, machines, and sheet metal fabrications. So, is there any opportunity for us to work with Swiss companies? I think you've largely mentioned about the possibilities, but still, if you'd like to say a few words on this question. Mr. Keller, we can't hear you. I think now, if you try, maybe. No, we are not. Mr. Keller, maybe meanwhile, while we check on the connectivity, let me move on to the next question, which is posed to the legal and tax team. I think Priyanka, you will have to take this. It deals with the tax matters. It says that IP ownership is an important aspect to capture larger value share in the electronics industry. Several countries have moved to regimes such as patent box, when if the patent is developed in the country, then there's substantial deduction in taxes from revenues accrued from commercialization of this patent. So is the government looking at such tax regimes for India?
Yes, in fact, we already have one. So in the year of 2016, our finance minister has already introduced a patent box regime, in terms of which patents developed and registered in the country and commercialized for use, whether in the country or outside, are subjected to a beneficial tax rate of 10%.
Mm-hmm.
So this is already in place. However, there are certain conditions associated with this, but I believe those would be easily achievable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So with that, we come to the conclusion of this webinar. And with that, we come to the conclusion of this webinar series. The 12 webinars we've organized on 12 different sectors, showcasing the opportunities available for Indian and Swiss business ecosystems to enhance their linkages. All the presentations which we made today would be available on our website. You can access it from there. We'll also be converting this webinar into a video and podcast and uploading on website. You can upload it. You can exit it from there. I would like to thank all the presenters we had with us today. Our guest speaker from India, Mr. Vinod Sharma. Our two guests of honor, Mr. Phil Reich, representing the Swiss Indian Chamber of Commerce, and Mr. Raul Keller, representing the Swissmem. As our guest speaker had mentioned, that today is the World Environment Day. So let me close this webinar series with some thoughts on sustainable development. India has a strong focus on sustainable development, including leadership at the global level in the form of International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. I end with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "Supposing I have come by a fair amount of wealth, either by way of legacy or by means of trade and industry, I must know that all that wealth does not belong to me. What belongs to me is the right to an honorable livelihood, no better than that enjoyed by millions of others. The rest of my wealth belongs to the community and must be used for the welfare of the community." With those words of wisdom, I thank all of you for joining us. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.